tackle this issue of housing. Okay, so I already did the Genesis commercial. Just a few words here about sort of why we're facing the shortage of housing, and whether you are in Danforth, Maine, or Bangor, Maine, or Baltimore, Maryland, or Chicago, Illinois, the dynamics obviously are different in scale, but the principles behind the dynamics are relatively consistent. We have largely been underbuilding multifamily housing in response to demographic changes for decades. That's sort of like one of these up here trends that you think, well, maybe it doesn't really affect us because I'm in this little small town. But it does, because the real estate market generally works on opportunity and availability for capital. And generally, the real estate developers, whether they're building something for their own use or for somebody else to use, are going to be making those investments and those decisions to build because there's an economic incentive for them. They're going to make money doing it. And what has been changing is, with the lack of new supply coming along, prices going up, households getting smaller, populations moving from rural areas to more village center areas, the demand has gone crazy, but the supply isn't there. And we could have another hour conversation about the economics that go on about why the supply isn't there. There's a lot of indicators about labor shortages and material costs, et cetera, but not all of them, not all of the reason is because of those two things. And as we mentioned, Charles mentioned briefly earlier, that the opportunities for telecommuting and with your broadband investment here, you are attracting people who can come here and work someplace else, which is a fabulous thing for a local economy, but it also means that those people may not be here all of the time, and they may come up and purchase property that they're only going to use occasionally or seasonally, and then there's just a lot more mobility in the workforce that can work from a number of different places. And with the beautiful opportunities of the East Grand area, there's very likely a number of houses or small properties that normally would have been churning in a more healthy real estate market that just aren't available. And there's very little new building going on, at least from the data that I've seen. So there's a couple of trends. When you're in a small marketplace, you don't need more than 10 or 15 sort of one-off experiences in the data to actually start a real trend. And so in a smaller community, in a rural town particularly, a change in 15 or 20 properties that normally would have been coming up for sale or being rented that are suddenly off the market creates a 0% inventory or something like that. So it doesn't take much in a small market area to create the crisis trends that we're seeing now. And I want to just say that short-term rentals, there's a two-sided coin to that. I'm not going to take a position on it. I happen to be a counselor in the town that I live in. I live in Freeport. I've been on the council there for a number of years. And we sort of wrestle with this issue about whether or not short-term rentals, particularly short-term rentals that are being purchased by investor entities, largely from out of town, is that a good thing or is that a not good thing? And in this area where you have lots of recreation opportunities, short-term rental acquisitions and occupancy might be one of the contributing factors to why there's not enough inventory available. On the plus side, those are properties that are now highly functioning, probably getting improvements, probably paying their taxes on time, and maybe even paying more taxes because the properties are improved. So there's two sides there, but the short-term rental dynamic, which is everywhere thanks to the internet, and now everybody here has it at high speed, you can find a short-term rental pretty quickly. Last month, my son got married on Mount Desert Island. And we were advised by residents there, his neighbors, oh, by the way, when you have your family plan to come up here, make sure you get well ahead of time. And we found it was actually quite difficult to find something on Mount Desert Island And we started in March of 2024. He got married at the end of September. We were lucky to find something nearby. So short-term rentals are a definite wave in the real estate market. They are largely unregulated. And so with the opportunities and the, the quote-unquote efficiency of the market, having a product and a buyer going right together without any sort of interference like a government or a registration or even some kind of regulation on it, can really change what's happening and what's available in your real estate market. In my community, there's a lot of homeowners who have really nice properties that are near or on the water, because we're a coastal community. You probably have a lot of properties here that are on or near lakes or have fantastic views. And those properties may have difficulty paying the taxes. So somebody who lives there and can go visit Aunt Lou for a couple of months and make some money on short-term rentals, that's usually seen as a good thing in an economy. But when properties are being purchased by out-of-state investors, and where there used to be a household that had kids in the school or a household that had somebody working at your local health center is now occupied 6 times a month by visitors, that puts a different spin on your local economy. Again, I'm not taking a plus or minus on short-term rentals. I'm just trying to point out that it is worth paying attention to. And as the communities here in the surrounding area may just consider understanding a little bit more about what's happening with short-term rentals. At an economic summit, I can't resist the opportunity to make this statement. It's maybe a little too ordinary or elementary, but it is worth mentioning that if you go to the circles that you're all involved in and really stress the point that economic development is housing development, and housing development is economic development, that's a connection that not everybody makes, and particularly taxpayers in the community who aren't paying attention necessarily to all the knobs that are being turned at town hall or with projects going through a planning board, may not see that tight connection and may see it as, well, I'm not sure we need any more housing because that's going to change our school budget when we have more kids in the school. In some communities, there are school districts that are waiting for kids to come to their community. And in other school districts, they're like, nope, we don't want any multifamily housing here because it's going to put more kids in the school and it's going to raise my taxes. So that's a two-edged side to that. But housing development is economic development. As was mentioned briefly earlier, you have to have a place for your workforce in your community, up and down the wage and job sectors, from the high-paid professionals to the service workers to the public employees in the school districts and municipalities. In my community, our police chief was hired about 4 years ago, could not find a place that he could afford to live in our community. He has to live 2 towns away. We just hired a new fire chief who lives in Scarborough. He has to drive 35 minutes to come to work in Freeport. Our town manager, who we hired in December, the highest paid person in our town government, couldn't afford to live in Freeport, had to move to a place in Brunswick after she got outbid by 7 other cash buyers trying to find a place to live. So if it's that hard for the town manager to find a place to live, imagine how hard it is for a plow truck supervisor or a public works employee or a police officer. I don't know what the dynamics are with municipal hiring and challenges right here in Danforth, because I haven't looked at that data, but I know that in Washington County that is a key element, and as Chris was mentioning earlier, being just able to attract candidates. You have to be able to say, oh yeah, there's some listings over here, and there's an apartment building that might have something available. If you can't say that, it's going to be very hard to hire anybody. So I have a couple of tools here. I encourage folks, before you go out and buy a piece of land or hire a contractor to come build your building, is to really understand some of the data that's going on. And in small communities, often you can feel like the data that you find out about, or something that's coming out of the state economist's office, doesn't apply here because we're a small town. But with technology improvements and the census, there's actually quite a bit of local data that is very accurate and pretty up to date, maybe only a year old, in terms of what's happening with your population. There's two sources that I highly encourage community groups to get involved with when they're trying to understand the data that's going on related to housing in their community. Last fall, the state and Maine State Housing Authority, our housing finance agency, commissioned a report from a national consultant called H&RA. And it released a report, essentially a housing assessment for the state of Maine. And you probably heard reference to this. This is the report that says we need 84,000 units by 2030. We're short 34,000 units today. Those numbers sort of can just wash over you like, you know, yeah, it's going to rain tomorrow, okay? What do I do about it? So the numbers can be numbing, but in that report now, available to everybody in Maine, right down to your small community, you can dive into that data. MaineHousingData.org is the website, and you click on the button that says access the report, and then in the upper right hand corner there's a button that says get detailed report, and you type in your town, Danforth or Waite or Orient or Holton or wherever you're from, and you can get lots of data, visible graphs that you can use to make some decisions. But mostly what it really is valuable for is it allows you to take actual numbers, real data, to a public conversation. And when folks stand up and say, we don't need this because I didn't have to deal with that in 1972 when I was growing up, and we don't need this over here because I don't see anybody that's struggling with trying to find housing. So when you come across sort of emotional reactions to what your progressive plans might be to do something, it's really good to have data in your pocket and be able to share graphs and be able to say, I understand your feeling about that, but here's what the data shows. And the data is truthful. The data is full of census figures and labor market data to be able to tell your story a little bit better than sort of just arguing over a particular point. Another source that we use is from census.org. It's not the US Census Bureau, but it's a nonprofit that has access to their databases. And again, you type in your town, and it'll give you trends over the last 5 years or 10 years about what's happening with the population, both in household size, household income, and most importantly, sort of where the age cohorts are trending in your community. Is your community getting younger? Is your community getting older? I think we mostly know most of our communities are getting older. So that can help you make decisions about where the demand is going to be for a particular product that you're trying to bring into the community. And you match up the age cohort data, sort of giving you the hard numbers of where the demand is going to be with the kind of product that you might be presenting. And that way, again, the data itself isn't going to convince a banker, okay, here's $2 million to go build your building. But you use that data to go to your public meetings to get community support for that project. And the bankers live in the community. And when the banker sees the community support for the project, they're much more likely to say yes to a finance package. So really understanding the data. I'll do a commercial here for TIFs, tax increment financing, which is a particular tool in Maine that municipalities, I think, are underusing. I don't know if there's been any TIF discussion in Danforth, but I know they've used it in Holton because I was attached to a project there about 15 years ago, a senior housing project that was built in downtown Holton. It benefited from a TIF, and the TIF made it happen. Tax increment financing is a way for the community and the project owner to co-invest in the success of that property into the future. And many times a TIF discussion will come up in a public hearing, and there'll be a reaction of, we're giving away our tax money to this developer. And in fact, if you look at how the funds actually flow, the project usually is the benefit of the financing, not the developer. The project probably won't happen, or at least won't happen the way you like it, without the TIF. So another way to describe this sometimes when I'm at local meetings, and the reaction is, a TIF is going to take away our tax money, so I don't want to do that, then my conclusion is, okay, you can have 100% of the empty lots tax revenue. You can have 100% of that tax revenue that's this big. or you can share 50 or 60% of the tax revenue on the finished project that looks like this. So you can have 100% of today's number, which is near zero, or you can have some of the future tax revenue for a project that's going to add vitality, be able to attract workers, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a tool that municipalities can use today without a burden on their town budget, because you're not writing a check, you're not handing a developer $200,000. You're requiring them to participate in a contract where the future tax revenue that they're going to pay the town is shared. The town gets to do very specific things with its portion, like maybe put up sidewalks, or maybe enhance the community center, put in a basketball court, whatever the TIF district language says that the town writes. And the project gets to benefit because their tax bill is now a little bit lower. And so that allows, generally, the way TIFs work in a development, it allows them to borrow a little bit more money to get the project done, because costs are high, appraisals are still not high enough for the developer to borrow all that money. So they need some kind of a gap filler, and often a TIF, excuse me, from a community can be all the difference in the world in providing a small slice of that financing. We could talk for another hour and a half on TIFs. I just wanted to mention it. You're going to see it a couple of times in future slides. Go back to your community, ask your town manager or your economic development person or your planner, whoever you have on staff that would be able to work on this, and then find someone who's done it and ask them how it's working for them. Because most of the time, in fact, nearly all the ones that I come across are highly successful. So I encourage you to find out about that. Okay, so the three-legged stool that Chris described, just by coincidence, I have a three-sided project model that I've been using. And I try and share this really to kind of simplify the elements of project development. I see a number of faces here, so probably this is going to, again, be very elementary because you've developed projects. But if you haven't been attached to the nuts and bolts of putting together a real estate project, there's a number of complexities in there that aren't always on the surface and aren't always just in the headline of whether it's pro or anti the project. So I try and break it down into the three sides of a project are related to